in this scene, we're going to talk about how to make a menu. And you'll recognize this from the showcase video. This is the Castle Storm scene. And you can see here we've got a bunch of fog sprites. You can just ignore those. Those are eye candy. Now before we start talking about making a menu, let me talk real fast about a topic that's going to come up when you're using a menu with a non-orthographic camera. Let's take these 3 buttons here for an example. Suppose I've just created these buttons and just built the atlas for them, and they're not sized to how I'm going to want them on the screen. As you can see, they're all warped. In fact, usually when you create a new button, it's going to be sized 0 by 0. So as you can see, you can't even see it there. So the question is, when we're not using an orthographic camera, how do we get our buttons and other sprite-based elements in the scene to be sized the way we want them? Since there's no such thing as pixel perfect in this situation, since we actually want the sprite to change its apparent size as it moves toward and away from the camera. So one thing I could obviously do is take the button that I've just sized to 0, and I could size it up, and you can see it change in size there. And I could get about where I want and just eyeball it and decide that that looks pretty good. The problem is, how am I going to get these other buttons to look the same? So for instance, I could go ahead and try to size this by eyeballing it, but it's going to be hard to get it looking exactly proportionate to the other one. Obviously, it's going to be a different physical size. I can't just look at this one and copy the width and height and put it in here. If I did that, then it would be the same width as this button, but that wouldn't be right because this is a longer word. So how can I size this in a way where I know that it's proportionate to all the other buttons on the screen? Well, that's where our size sprites menu option comes in again. What I can do is select these 3 buttons and choose custom size sprites. And now, instead of entering the actual screen height that I've got, since that value is really only meaningful when I'm using an orthographic camera, instead I can just pick an arbitrary value and see what I get, and then tweak that value until I get something that looks about like I'm wanting. So I want to tell it I'm going to apply only to the selected buttons, and I'll choose a value. Let's go for 1000, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, obviously that's way too big. So when it turns out bigger than we want, we actually want to increase this number here. So let's try 5,000. Okay, that's a lot closer. So let's try it one more time. And this time let's try 10,000. And that looks just right. So as you can see, all 3 buttons are sized proportionately to one another. And if we just remember the number we used when we sized our sprites, and use that for all of our other sprites in the scene. In fact, we can just go here and choose size sprites and apply all to scene. We can also apply it to prefabs in our project folder if we want to. And that will make sure that all of our sprites and controls are sized proportionate to one another. Okay, so on to creating our menu. So we're going to start out with a game object, and we'll call this the main panel, because it's going to be the first item in our main menu. And we will add a regular panel component. And I've got a panel manager object already added to the scene. There's not really a whole lot to it. Basically, you would select a game object and go and add under management the panel manager. And that's what we use to do wizards and menus. The UI panel manager object lets you select a default panel, and we'll put our main panel under the panel manager. And that's important. Any controls that are going to be managed by a panel need to be children of the panel, and any panels that are going to be managed by a panel manager need to be children of the panel manager, as you can see here. And if you want to have multiple sets of panels that get managed, then you want to have multiple panel managers. But when you're using a panel manager, only one panel can be the current panel at a time for that manager. So that's why we use it for things like menus, so that we only have one page up at a time, and we can transition from one page to another, but we only have one up at a time. If for some reason you want to have 2, let's say side by side or something, you could actually have 2 panel managers and have panels attached to each of them and be able to do it that way. Now let's go ahead and add some controls to our main panel. And for the sake of time, I've already got a prefab here that has some controls in it. So here you can see we've got our logo, which is a sprite, and 3 buttons. Now let's move these in view so that they align with our camera a little better. And now we want to make these children of the main panel. So we just drag them on, and there they are. Now let's look and see what kind of controls we added here. Now when we want to go to, for instance, our options menu, the options menu is another panel. It's its own panel. So the options button is a UI button change panel. So you'll see that under components as well. It's listed here as a change panel button. If you look in the controls folder, it's called UI button change panel. And what the change panel button does, it works just like a regular button. So the setup is exactly the same as a regular button. The only difference is that you select a panel manager that it's going to talk to. And in our case, it's going to be our menu system manager. And then we can tell it what we want it to do. So for instance, we can tell it we want it to bring a panel in, we can dismiss a panel, and then we can decide if we want to bring it in a specific direction. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. Or we can toggle a panel, or we can have it move us forward and backward in a sequence. And that's useful for things like wizards, where we have a next and a back button. And we'll talk about that more when we get to wizards. And then finally, assuming we have selected an option such as bring in or bring in forward, we can set the panel that we actually want it to bring in. So we can actually type in the name of the panel, and that will be the panel that it brings in. Now if we had selected forward or backward, there's no need to specify which panel because it's just going to move the wizard in that direction. So now let's tell this panel how we want it to behave. Since we just looked at these different change types, bring in, forward, backward, and dismiss, it's important to realize that in a menu or a wizard, you basically have 2 directions that the menu can go. It can go forward or backward. So like think about it like in a wizard, you can do next or back. That's considered forward or backward in the menu. And in the case of a nonlinear menu, you still have a backward and forward direction that you can move. So let's go ahead and look at the transitions we can choose from on this panel. And you'll see we've got bring in forward, bring in back, dismiss forward, dismiss back. So when we're bringing a panel in, the panel is coming into view and it's going to become the current panel. Because we talked about earlier, for any particular panel manager, there can only be one current panel at a time. So when we bring it in, that's going to become the current panel, and whatever the panel was before that is going to be dismissed. So the question becomes, in which direction is the menu moving, or is the wizard moving? So if the wizard's moving forward, then the panel that's coming in to become the current panel is going to be using the bring in forward transition. If the panel was our current panel and is being dismissed because we're moving forward in the menu or wizard, then it's going to use the dismiss forward. That means the panel is getting dismissed and the menu is moving in the forward direction. If, let's say, the user hits the back button, then the panel that's coming into view as a result of that is using the bring in back transition, and the panel that is being dismissed is going to be using the dismiss back transition. So we want to define all 4 of these in our case, because what we want to happen is we want these panels to move forward and backward with respect to the camera, and it's going to look really cool. So let's go ahead and start defining our transition. And let's begin with the bring in forward. Now you'll notice there's an extra button over here called block input. And what that does is that allows us to disable input while this transition is taking place. And when the transition's finished, then as long as there aren't any other transitions that are blocking input, then the user will be able to click on buttons and things like that again. But this is useful so that when you have panels sliding this way and that way across the screen, you don't have people accidentally clicking on buttons and all that. But if for some reason you don't want it to behave that way, you can uncheck block input, and it'll still receive input while the transition's taking place. But let's go ahead and turn that on, and let's add an element to our transition. Now the first thing we want to do is we want to have this panel zoom towards the camera, and since it's going to come in from far away and come into view, then we want it to start at a distance. So we're going to want to use another from to, and where it is right now actually looks pretty good for where we want it to be when it settles into view. So we want the end position to be the current position, but we want it to start at a distance, so we'll drag it off, let's say out to here, and we'll set that as the starting position, so we'll click the current button, and we want this transition to take 1.5 seconds. Now I already have a script added to my project which calls the panel manager and tells it to bring in the main panel at the very start, and this can be done with a single line of code. So let's go ahead and test this and see what it looks like so far. Okay, that's pretty good, but it would look a lot better if it would fade in as it comes toward the camera. So let's select the panel again, and let's add a second transition element, and this time it's going to be a fade sprite element, and we want it to happen in sync with our other element, so we'll also make it 1.5 seconds. And I think in this case a sinusoidal in easing type would look best, and we'll go from transparent to full white. So now let's hit play and see what we have. Okay, that looks better. Now, when the panel is dismissed forward, we want it to continue moving towards the camera and fade out. So we'll choose the dismiss forward transition, and again you'll see that this carries over all the settings from our previous transition, and that's because we haven't changed anything for this particular transition to make it retain its own unique values. And that's handy if we wanted all the different transitions to basically do the same thing, then we would only have to define it one time. But let's go ahead and start to define this dismiss forward. So we can see here that our end position from the previous transition was this value. So basically let's set that back to where it was. This is where it's going to be when it is the current panel. And we want it to move from here towards the camera. So we're going to set this as the start position for the dismiss animation. And slide it towards the camera like so. And that's going to be the end position. And then we'll select the fade sprite element. And this time we want it to start out opaque and end transparent. And now we can flesh out the remaining two transitions. So let's do dismiss back, and this is when the panel gets dismissed when we're going backward in the menu. So since this is a dismiss transition, we want it to fade to transparent, so we're going to leave the colors the same on the fade sprite element, and we'll go to the translate element, and we like where the starting position is because it's going to be dismissed from its position in front of the camera. So all we need to do is specify where it's going to go to when it's dismissed in the backward direction. So we'll move it back far away from the camera, like so, and record the end position. And now finally, we'll set up the bring in back transition, and that's when we're bringing the panel into view while the menu is moving in a backwards direction. So the panel is going to start out near the camera, like so. That's going to be our start position, and we want it to wind up at its position in front of the camera, and we can remember that that position was z equals 0, so we'll go ahead and just enter that here. And then we can't forget to change the fade sprite transition. Since it's being brought into view, we want it to start out faded, and we want it to end opaque. And now we have defined all the different transitions for this panel. Now you'll see we already have other panels set up for this menu. We've got the options panel already set up, audio and multiplayer, but they don't have any transitions defined. Now we went to some effort to set up the transitions for our main panel. It would really be nice if we could just take all those settings and paste them onto these other panels. And fortunately, we can do exactly that. So we'll go ahead and select our main panel and go to Custom and Copy Transitions. And now we can select all three of these at once and go to Custom Paste Transitions. And that fills out their transitions, and now they will be exactly the same as the main panel. Now we're about ready to go ahead and test this out, but let's review real fast. This main panel has a button which is going to take us to the Options panel, and if we'll recall, this is a UI button change panel type, and it's going to tell the panel manager for this menu to bring in the Options panel. Now, as we've discussed, when we click that Options button, what should happen is it will dismiss the current panel, which is the main panel we're looking at here, and it's going to bring in the Options panel. It's going to bring it into view. And by default, since we haven't specified here whether we're bringing in forward or backward, the default is forward. So this panel that we're looking at is going to move toward the camera, since that was how we defined it to behave in the forward direction. And the Options panel will move towards the camera as well into view. So now let's click play and give this a test. So now if I click this Options button, it's going to move us forward in the menu to the Options panel. And there we have it. Now we haven't set these buttons up yet, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and stop it. And also, you probably noticed when we hit play, this panel was in view and then suddenly disappears and then comes into view again. We don't like that. So what we could do, like we've done with these other panels, is we could just move it off to the side. And since our bring in transition uses the from to mode, it will start where we want it to and end up where we want it, even though we dragged it off to the side. Another thing we could have done is we could leave it in front of the camera and select the panel manager and tell it to deactivate non-default panels at start. So let's go ahead and give that a try. Now let's go ahead and finish setting up the other panels. So if we go to the Options panel, we can drag it into view. And let's go ahead and move our main panel out of the way so we're not cluttering the screen. And we'll select the back button, and we'll see that this is also a UI button change panel. And in this case, the change type is set to bring in back. So it's going to bring in the main panel, and it's bringing it in the back direction. So it's actually going to move us backward in the menu. So let's go ahead and hit play and try that out. And if we click the Options button, it takes us to the Options panel. And if we click back, it's going to move us in the back direction and dismiss this panel and bring in the main panel. And there you have it.